In the spring of 1873, on the raw, open prairie of central Nebraska, a man named Jonah List began planting a forest that he knew he would not live to sit under. He set out little whips of cottonwood and box elder and ash, switches no thicker than your finger, in long rows around the four sides of his claim, hundreds of them, then thousands, in a country where there was not a tree from one horizon to the other, and where every other man was breaking sod to get his wheat in while the season lasted. Jonah List broke sod too, but every spring and every fall for the rest of his life, he also planted trees on ground that grew him nothing, guarding against a thing his neighbors did not think needed guarding against. And the whole county came in time to agree that the man was a harmless lunatic who had got trees on the brain. I am his granddaughter. My name is Ruth, and I grew up inside the forest he planted, in a green and sheltered place on a prairie that has broken the hearts of nearly everyone who ever tried to live on it open to the sky.
And I am telling you this because my grandfather was proved right, entirely right, at the exact scale he intended. And he was proved right 30 years after he began and 10 years after he died. And there is no other way to be proved right about a tree. And almost nobody has the patience for it. And he did. You have to understand the prairie he came to, because the emptiness of it is the whole reason for what he did, and the whole reason no one understood him. Central Nebraska in those years was a sea of grass without a single tree, flat and open to a sky that went on forever. And the beauty of it was real, and so was the cruelty. The wind. People who have not lived on the open plains do not understand about the wind, that it is not weather that comes and goes, but a thing that is simply always there, a hand pressing on the country and everything in it, every hour of every day. In summer, it came hot out of the south and dried the fields and stole the moisture out of the ground and out of a man's very skin. In winter, it came screaming down out of the north with nothing between Canada and your door to slow it. And it drove the snow before it and drove the cold through every wall and drove some people, over a long enough time, clean out of their minds. There is a thing the old-timers spoke of, that the wind on the open prairie, the ceaseless sound and push of it that never once let up, wore on the settlers, on the women especially, alone in a soddy all day with that wind, until some of them broke under it. The wind was the great fact of that country, and most people simply bore it, because what else could you do about the wind? Jonah List decided to do something about the wind. That was the strangeness of him. Where every other man accepted the wind as you accept the sky, my grandfather looked at it as a problem to be solved, and he had in his head an answer that would take 20 years to grow, and he was willing, alone among all of them, to start. The talk began, as it does, at the places men gathered, the mill and the land office, and it was good-natured at first, and only later turned unkind. Jonah List had come out from Ohio, from a country of woods and farms, and he could not abide a treeless land. That much the neighbours understood, and even shared. But a man was allowed a few trees by his house for shade, and no one thought the worse of him. What no one could understand was the scale of it, and the placing of it. My grandfather did not plant a shade tree or two by the door. He planted belts of trees, wide bands of them, several rows deep, along the whole north and west sides of his claim, and in time the other sides too. Hundreds of yards of trees, thousands of seedlings. And he tended them like children, hauling water to them by the barrel through the dry summers when a man's water was precious, replanting the ones that died, which was many, cultivating the ground between them, spending on those trees the labour and the water and the daylight that his neighbours spent on crops that paid. And the trees did not pay. For years and years, they did not pay anything at all. They were just thin sticks in the wind, then thin saplings bent over in the wind, growing slowly, so slowly, while Jonah List poured his life into them and got nothing back that anyone could see.
A man named Dietrich, who farmed near them and grew the best wheat in the township and never let anyone forget it, was the one who hung the name on my grandfather. He called him the tree farmer, and he did not mean it kindly. He meant that a real farmer grew wheat and made money, and a foolish one grew trees and made shade. And he would ask at the mill, loud, how the tree crop was coming, and whether Jonah List meant to ship his lumber to Chicago, and the men would laugh. The tree farmer. And my grandmother heard it, and my father, who was a boy then, heard it in the schoolyard, the way children always inherit the mockery aimed at their fathers, and it was not easy for them, being the family of the man who wasted his life on trees, while the sensible men grew rich on wheat. For the wheat years were good then, in the 70s and the 80s, wet years, kind years, and the men who put everything into wheat prospered, and the man who put a fifth of his labour into a windbreak that did nothing looked like a fool who was being taught a lesson by the market every single season. I will tell you the one thing that hung in my grandfather's house, and then I will let it wait, because its meaning is the meaning of everything he did. On the wall of the soddy, and later the frame house, there hung a small framed thing that was not a picture. It was a pressed leaf. A single leaf from a hardwood tree, an oak leaf, mounted under glass. And it had come with him from Ohio, from the farm he grew up on, from a great oak that had stood by his father's house and his grandfather's house before him. A tree that had sheltered 3 generations of his family and had been, he said, older than the county. He had carried that one pressed leaf across the country to the treeless plains, and hung it where he would see it, and once, when I was small and asked him about it, he took it down and held it and said, "A man that plants a tree is planting for his grandchildren." He looked at me when he said it. He was, I understood, many years later, telling me exactly what I was, which was the grandchild he had been planting for, before I was ever born. What my grandfather understood, and the wheat men did not, was not complicated, but it ran against the whole hurry of the country, and that is why they could not hear it. He understood that the wind was not free. It looked free, it cost nothing to let it blow, and so everyone let it blow, but it was taking a price all the time, every day, a price so constant that people had stopped noticing they were paying it. It dried their fields and cost them moisture they then had no rain to replace. It drove their winter snow off their fields and out of their yards and away, snow that was water they needed, piling it uselessly in the drawers instead of letting it lie and soak into the ground where it fell. It stole the warmth from their houses and made their stoves burn double. It beat their crops and their gardens and their stock and their children all year, forever. And against all of that, my grandfather knew, from the woods of Ohio, that a belt of trees was the oldest and best answer there is. Not a wall, which the wind tears down or scours around, but a living, yielding, porous barrier that does not stop the wind, but breaks it, filters it, slows it, lifts it up and over, and lets it down gentled on the far side. So that for a long stretch downwind of a good tree belt, the ground is calmer and warmer and moister, and the snow lies still where it falls, and everything that lives there lives easier. He was not planting trees. He was planting shelter for a piece of the prairie and everything that would ever live on it, and he was planting it at the only speed shelter of that kind can be planted, which is the slow speed of a tree. And he had made his peace with not living to stand in its full shade himself. He said it to Dietrich once, the only time he ever answered the mockery, and my father heard it and carried it to me. Dietrich had asked him at the mill, laughing, when the great forest would be finished, and my grandfather said, "I won't see it finished." He was not troubled saying it. "My children will. That is who I'm planting it for." And he picked up his sack and went home to his trees. And Dietrich told it as the final proof the man was simple, planting a thing he admitted he'd never get the good of, and most of the county agreed, because most people cannot understand doing a great work you will not live to see the end of, and my grandfather could understand nothing else. His trouble, the flaw that gave the mockers their years of ammunition, was that trees die, and on that dry, wind-scoured prairie they died by the 100. His first plantings, set too far apart and too shallow and given too little water, were savaged by the very wind they were meant one day to break, whipped and dried and killed, whole rows of them gone brown in a single hot, windy week. And Jonah List would walk his dead rows in the evening, and the neighbours driving past would see him there, among his failures, and shake their heads. Dietrich said the trees were voting on the tree farmer's sense, and voting no. And it was true that for years my grandfather planted more trees than lived, and buried more labour in that ground than it gave back, and a lesser or a wiser man, depending how you reckon wisdom, would have quit a dozen times. He did not quit, he learned. He learned that a windbreak cannot be planted all at once, but must be nursed row by row, that the first outer rows of tough, scrappy things, the willows and the box elders that will suffer anything, must go in first and grow enough to shelter the tenderer, better trees planted in their lee, so that a tree belt is itself built up in stages behind its own growing shelter, the hardy pioneers protecting the slow hardwoods, the way he was protecting his own children behind his labour. He learned to plant thick and close so the trees sheltered one another and drew each other up. He learned to cultivate the ground and hoard the moisture and haul the water in the killing summers, and row by row, year by year, decade by decade, against the wind and the drought and the mockery and the plain slowness of the thing, the shelter belt of Jonah List grew and thickened and rose, until at last it began, quietly, to do the thing he had promised it would do, long after everyone had stopped expecting it to, and by then some of the ones who had laughed were dead, and the wheat years were about to end. The signs that the good years were ending were there for anyone who read the sky the way my grandfather read it. But the wheatmen were not in the habit of reading the sky, because the sky had been good to them for 20 years. For the rains that had made the wheatmen rich were not the normal condition of that country, though they had farmed as if they were. They were a wet spell, a run of unusually kind years, and such spells always end, and this one ended hard. In the early 1890s, when the dry years came to the plains, several of them in a row, the worst of them in 1894, a year of heat and drought and wind that the whole prairie remembers who had anyone in it then. And the dry years, when they came, did not test the wheat, they tested the wind. Because a dry year on the open plains is not merely a year without rain. It is a year in which the wind, unopposed, takes the little moisture there is and gives nothing back, in which the ground bakes and cracks, and then begins, in the worst of it, to blow, the dry topsoil lifting off the naked fields and travelling, and the crops burning in the hot, ceaseless gale, and the snow of the previous winter long since scoured away downwind instead of soaking in where it fell. The open farms, the sensible wheat farms with nothing between them and the sky, took the dry years full in the face. The wind and the drought did not care whose land they crossed, or which man had grown the best wheat, or which had wasted his life on trees. But they found out the difference, at last, between the two. Now I will tell you what those dry years showed, because it is the whole of what my grandfather had waited 30 years and gone to his grave to prove, and he had died just before the proving, in 1892, 2 years before the worst of it, an old man who had never once stood in the full shelter of his finished work. He was buried, at his own asking, at the foot of his own tree belt, in its shade, the only shade for miles, and I think about that often, that he got into that shelter at last, only by dying into it. On the open farms, the dry years were a slow catastrophe. Dietrich's great wheat fields, the best in the township, unsheltered, took the hot south wind of those summers, and there was nothing to break it, and the crops shriveled, and the precious ground moisture went up into the dry air and was gone. And in the worst summers, the very soil of those clean, open fields began to lift and blow, the topsoil that was the whole wealth of the place, travelling away on the wind a little more each dry year. And in winter the snow that should have watered that ground came down and did not stay, driven across the bare open fields by the same wind and piled uselessly in the road cuts and the draws, so that the land was robbed at both ends of the year, of its soil in summer and its snow water in winter, by the wind that no one but my grandfather had ever thought to fight. And behind the shelterbelt of Jonah List, in the long green lee of the trees the whole county had laughed at for 30 years, it was a different country. I know, because by then I was a child living in it. Behind those trees, the wind that howled across the open land arrived gentled and broken, so that the fields in their lee kept their moisture in their soil, did not blow, did not burn as the open fields burned. In winter, the snow blew off the prairie and reached the tree belt, and there, in the still air among the trees, and in the calm lee beyond them, it lay down and stayed, all winter. A long drift of it held right where it fell, and in the spring it melted down into the ground it lay on, instead of being carried off, so that the sheltered fields drank the winter snow that the open fields lost. The ground was warmer in the lee, and the stock stood easy in the shelter instead of suffering in the gale, and the house that my grandfather had built and that my father lived in used half the fuel of the open houses because the murderous winter wind never reached its walls. And the garden grew, and the orchard my grandfather had planted in the deepest shelter bore fruit. Actual fruit, apples on the Nebraska prairie, in years when the open farms could not raise a hill of beans. The thing he had promised 30 years before, to men who laughed, the trees now simply did, every day, for free, forever, having taken 30 years to begin. I promised I would make the plain sense of it clear, and it is this, and my grandfather understood it when almost no one else on that prairie did. The wind is the great constant thief of a dry, open country, and you cannot stop it, but you do not need to stop it. You need only break it. A solid wall makes the wind angry, scours around its ends and tumbles over its top in a rush that does more harm than good. But a belt of living trees, porous, yielding, letting some wind sift through and lifting the rest up and over and setting it down, softened far downwind, casts a long shadow of calm behind it, many times the height of the trees. And in that calm shadow everything is better. The moisture stays, the soil stays, the snow stays and soaks in, the warmth stays, the crops and the stock and the people are sheltered from the one enemy that never otherwise rests. It is not a fast answer, and it is not a cheap one. It costs land and labour and water, and above all it costs years, more years than most people can hold a purpose across. But it is the truest answer there is to a windswept land, and it was known in the old countries for centuries before my grandfather carried it to Nebraska. And he did not invent it. He only had the rare thing it required, which was the patience to plant for a harvest of shelter he would not live to reap. Mind, it was not a magic wall, and my grandfather never claimed it was. The shelterbelt protected its own long lee and no more. It could not save the whole county, only the piece of ground behind it, and the open farms beyond its reach suffered the dry years fully. It cost, all told, a third of a lifetime, and a great deal of water and the labour of a family that could have gone to easier wealth. It did not make my grandfather rich. The wheat men in the good years were far richer than he ever was. It made him something else, which was secure, and it made his children and his grandchildren secure after him, on a piece of prairie that stayed livable when much of the open land around it was blowing away. And that was the whole of what he had ever wanted. And it was not nothing, but it was not a fortune either, and he would want me to tell you so. The dry years passed, as they do, and better years came back, and then dry years again, for that is the true rhythm of that country, which the wet spell had hidden and the trees had understood better than the men. And slowly, over the years after my grandfather's death, the thing happened that he had not lived to see and had planted for anyway. The county came around, not with a grand apology, for the men who had laughed were mostly gone by the time the trees had fully proved them wrong, and the ones still living were not the speech-making kind. It came around the way the truth about a tree always comes around, silently, by everyone simply beginning to do the thing they had mocked. In the dry years and after, the farmers of that township, and then the county, and then the whole plains began to plant trees. Windbreaks and shelterbelts went in around farmstead after farmstead, along field after field, whole living walls of them set across the open land, and the men planting them mostly did not know or care that the first of them in that country had been a lunatic named Jonah List, who had been laughed out of the mill for 30 years. They planted because they had finally seen, in the dry years, what the wind cost and what a tree belt saved. And my grandfather, had he been alive, would not have minded in the least that they forgot him, because he had never been planting for the credit, any more than he had been planting for himself. I will tell you the last of it, about the pressed oak leaf, because it is time.
When my grandfather died and we buried him at the foot of his tree belt, my father took the framed oak leaf down from the wall, the leaf from the great tree in Ohio that had sheltered 3 generations of our family. And he did a thing I did not understand until I was grown. He did not keep it on the wall. He took the acorns he had gathered, for my grandfather in his last years had written to Ohio and had acorns sent from that very ancestral oak. And my father planted them in the deepest, best sheltered heart of the shelterbelt, in the calm green centre of the forest his own father had built to make such a thing possible, and one of them grew. There is an oak tree standing in the heart of my grandfather's shelterbelt in Nebraska today, the child of the oak that sheltered our family in Ohio, and it could never have survived 1 year on that open prairie in the old days, and it has stood 100 years now in the shelter my grandfather grew for it before it was ever planted, and my own grandchildren have sat under it. He planted a forest so that an oak could live, so that his family could live the way his family had always lived, under a great tree, on land that had never had one. That was the whole of it. That was what the tree farmer was doing, the whole 30 years the county laughed. I am an old woman now, and I have lived my entire life in the shelter of trees planted by a man I barely remember, and every easy thing about my life, the calm air and the snow-fed fields and the fruit and the warm house and the great oak in the green heart of it all, is a gift given to me by a grandfather who knew, when he gave it, that he would be 30 years dead before I could thank him, and who gave it anyway, and asked nothing, and was called a fool for it by sensible men whose wheat blew away. People ask me, when I tell it, how he had the patience, and I do not fully know, except that he loved his family forward, the way most of us only love backward, and he understood the one thing the hurrying world forgets, that the best shelter a person ever stands in was planted by someone who knew they would never sit in it. You cannot break the wind in a season. It takes a lifetime, and it takes doing the work for people whose faces you will never see. My grandfather did it, and I am one of the faces he never saw, and I have spent my life in his shade, and I planted trees for my own grandchildren, and they are grown now, and they are planting them for theirs. Now this family is ours, but here is what is true. The open plains were and are a country ruled by the wind, and the settlers of the treeless prairie suffered constantly from it, from the drying of their fields, the loss of their winter snow, the cold driven through their houses, and the wearing psychological weight of the ceaseless wind itself. Planted shelter belts and windbreaks, belts of trees set across the wind, are a real, old, and thoroughly proven answer, known in Europe for centuries, and championed on the American plains from the settlement era onward. A porous belt of trees does not stop the wind, but filters and lifts it, casting a sheltered zone many times the tree's height downwind, where moisture, soil, and snow are conserved, and crops, stock, and people are protected. The dry years of the 1890s, including the severe drought of 1894, were real,
and drove many open farm families off the plains. Decades later, after the Dust Bowl, the United States government would plant a great belt of trees across the plains for exactly these reasons, proving Jonah List's lonely idea at the scale of a nation. The people are imagined, the wind and the slow, patient wisdom of the men and women who planted trees they would never sit under are exactly as they were.